Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our fourth pandemic series. It's day 68, and we've taken a look at, I think, the issues that arise that's most in your mind. So we started with what it meant to be working at home, pandemic and families. We then looked at pandemics and well-being. Last time on the 7th of May, we talked about collaboration. And I've written, by the way, a Sloan article about that webinar, which we'll be sending to you once that's complete. And today is about leadership. Of course, remember that you can download any of these webinars because they do rather form a series. And also let me say that we're going to poll and we're going to use a new process called Menti. We sent an email to you about that. So do please download that app when you have a moment to do so, because at the end of this conversation, I'll be asking you to use that Menti. So please download the app. And also, by the way, do chat, because as ever, I have Dr. Anna Gurin, who heads up the research at HSM, looking at the questions, and she and I are going to be entering into a question session later on in the webinar. So please keep your questions going. Anna will take a look at them, and then we'll work those through later on. So let's begin. Where are we now on day 68? Well, here's three things that we think are very important to the context right now. Number one, still quite a lot of ambiguity about how work gets done and how we communicate. You remember, those of you who are on our last webinar, that we talked about that last time. And I think this whole question about home working, collaboration, innovation, boundaries is not going to be resolved easily. So that's still very ambiguous. Secondly, we've all learned a lot. And what we've mostly learned is we've really begun to turbocharge our digital transformation. And that's a set of skills that we're going to keep with us right through the rest of our working life. And thirdly, and this is particularly an issue for leaders, we're beginning to see legitimate power is moving to expert power and distributed power. What do I mean by that? Well, in general, leaders have their power because it's legitimized. They're a leader, they're your CEO, they're your head of department, therefore they're powerful. But what we're beginning to see as we see leaders in their homes, and as we see them stressed as much as everybody else, then that power is beginning to shift to expert power. Do you know anything about this situation? And distributed power. Can you really help us to understand collectively what we should do? So what we're going to talk about today is leading people through a pandemic. Of course, there's many things that your leaders are doing at the moment. They're negotiating debts. They're doing massive cost cutting. They're thinking about new partnerships. But what we're going to focus on specifically today is what it means as a leader, leading people through this pandemic. Now, I want to really start with trust, because the truth is that right now, trust is absolutely important. You know, you can see this in the US at the moment with the US election. It's very difficult for Biden because he's not there being a leader. He's not being seen to be a leader. That's true for many of your leaders. They're stuck in their house. They're talking to you through Zoom. So we have to be extra vigilant in terms of how we build trust. Let's remind ourselves that there's two ways that leaders are building trust right now. Number one, they're helping to build the interpersonal trust across the organization by fostering respect, by actually showing respect to others and to those across the organization. And remember that leaders lead a great deal through their own behaviors. So the role modeling of their behaviors is absolutely crucial. So their capacity to show that respect is going to be absolutely crucial. Secondly, the real issue right now in terms of institutional trust is burnout. We've talked about this before on our webinars. I've written about it. We know that this life that we're now living, where we're spending, 8 hours a day on Zoom, where we're spending very little time relaxing, doing all the little things we used to do in between meetings, that's all gone. And as a consequence of that, you'll remember, those of you at my last webinar on collaboration, one of the questions I asked in the poll was, what do you think's happened to productivity? Has it gone up? Is it the same? Has it gone down? 25% of you thought that productivity had actually gone up. And probably the reason that that's gone up is that people are working faster. So the organizations are speeding up, and that's really what's happening right now. We're getting the speed of these of productivity. That's a good thing. But the downside is that people are going too fast and they're becoming burnt out. And when you feel burnt out, you begin to lose trust. So the second aspect I'd like you really to think about is this notion of synchronicity. And by that, I mean that part of the role of a leader is to synchronize time, is to acknowledge that there's time when people should speed up and there's time when they should slow down. And how the leader behaves now is going to be very important in terms of building institutional trust. Now, let's think about the journey that your leaders are on. They started 60 days ago scrambling to understand what was happening right now. And of course, all of us are still pretty much blind when we think about the future. We really don't know what the future is going to be. We don't know the timing. So what we're beginning to see is leaders moving through 3 parts of this leadership journey. The first part and many of your leaders have already gone through that, is actually to what we would call hold the organization, to actually address some of the real emotional issues that people are feeling right now, and to really hold what's going on. But that's important. And actually for the first couple of weeks, that was absolutely crucial. But now people are asking for more. Employees are now looking to leaders to move into the second phase, which is to say, what's the story? What's the narrative? What is it that's going to happen, and what role can I play in that? And the great leaders are beginning to narrate a story about the future. But of course, that's not going to be enough, because many of you are in organizations with thousands of people. They're looking to the leader to narrate a story, but they also want themselves to be involved in co-creating the future. And so we think that the third phase, which some leaders are already beginning to move into, is to advance. So to advance by co-creating. So they acknowledge by holding, acknowledge the pain that people have been in. They act by beginning to build a narrative, and they advance by pulling people together through the process of co-creation. So we're going to take a look at each one of those in a little bit more detail. So let's start with holding, acknowledging what was going on by holding. Now, you might have remembered this slide from one of our earlier webinars, because what we observed very early on, and this hasn't really changed much, is that stress has increased. There's a lot of data to show that, particularly for people working at home with children, really trying to manage those boundaries. Do you remember early on in webinar 1, I talked about boundary management, and a lot of you have thought about that since. Quite a lot of us are feeling helpless, and that's actually part of the reason for stress. You know, from a psychological perspective, that people are healthier when they have some sense of control. And I think all of us, including our leaders, are feeling helpless about controlling this situation. And so it's no surprise that data from right across the world is showing that mental health in many places and in many companies is beginning to deteriorate. What can leaders do now? Well, here's our suggestion. And we use the word holding actually to sort of help you imagine that that's what the leader is doing. They're using their power, their energy, their leadership roles to hold the organization, to just as you would, you know, the analogy of holding a child. I mean, I don't really like to think about the parent-child relationships, but it is a holding relationship, providing support. How do they do that? Well, here's two ways that we've seen great leaders doing it over the last few weeks. We're using the word containing, soothing emotional distress, showing empathy. Some leaders have been wonderful at showing that actually they also are empathizing with people's situations. They are also understanding the distress. So soothing the distress, emotional distress, using the words to demonstrate that, reassuring, is absolutely crucial. And also interpreting, you know, the one thing we learned very early on in this pandemic is that people aren't the same. They differ in terms of their home circumstances. You know, being at home with 2 kids or 3 kids under the age of 6 is not the same as my situation, where I'm here with one of my elder children, but I'm not looking after any kids. So we had to really help people understand that we knew their situation, that we knew the help that they required, and we knew how to empower them. And so this notion of holding was absolutely crucial at the beginning. And the great leadership that we saw at the beginning of the pandemic really was about holding. That's not to say that that's not important, but actually people are now looking for more. They don't just want to have a holding environment. They're beginning to open their eyes, look up, see the sun, and they want to move to the next piece, which is narrative. But before we do that, let's ask a poll. This is our first poll, so it's an opportunity for you to see what you're thinking. Which of the following elements are you most I think the word is concerned. Sorry, I've got a picture of everybody here. Are you most concerned about for your organization? Number 1, reassuring employees about job security. Number 2, reassuring them about physical and mental health concerns. Number 3, reassuring them over feelings of helplessness. Which is the one that you're most concerned about? Perhaps it's none of the above, in which case, please do go into the chat and start talking to us about what it is that you're most concerned about right now. And then Anna will analyze that chat a little bit later. So do your polls. Which one do you think you're most concerned about? So Callie, I know, is looking at those polls right now. Which of the following elements are you most concerned about? Physical and mental health, yeah, more than almost half of you are saying that. So worrying about physical and mental health concerns, still important. Reassuring about job security, major issue, because of course, one of the things that we're all realizing is that when we come out of this pandemic, we will be moving into a recession. And those of us who have lived through recessions know that those are not the same as times of major growth. So one has to worry right now about long-term job security. So thank you very much for that. That's very helpful. Okay, let's take a look at the second area. So when you think about that pathway, the first was containing. The second was narrating. Why is this so important? Well, take a look at these two pictures of the brain. On the left-hand side is a brain that is receiving data and facts. And you can see the neurological sparking on that brain. This, by the way, is a neurological experiment. We haven't just made this up, but we're showing it to you in a slightly more stylized way. On the right is a brain which is listening to a story. And what that shows you is just how much more aspects of your brain are ignited when you listen to a story. That's why, by the way, any of you who read my books know I always use personas. And in fact, in the consulting and advisory work we're doing with some of you right now, you'll see also we're suggesting that you use stories of people, personas, to help people understand. So a narrative is fundamentally a story that really connects to people's brains, emotions in a much deeper way than data or facts do. So what do leaders do when they build a narrative? Well, you know, we found a couple of things that really make narratives very strong in terms of leadership. Number one, they're telling a story. Remember that the brain is very wired to hear stories. That's part of the reason, by the way, that in our own advisory work right now, we're using personas a lot to help people understand the future, telling the story of individuals. What does that narrative do? It contributes to sense making. You know, right now, part of the reason that people have mental illness problems is because they can't make sense of what's going on around them. When a leader builds a narrative, they're engaged in that process of sense making. They're helping people make sense of what's happening around them. And because it's a narrative that's shared across many people, it actually begins to build a collective identity. It's like watching, you know, the same film every night with 100 people. Next day you have something to talk about collectively. That's what great leaders do in terms of building their narrative. They create an event, something to talk about that builds that collective identity. So, what are effective narratives? They tell a compelling story, a story of what could be. They provide a concrete visualization. This is important because people need to have some sense of how the future is going to unfold, and they describe it in ways that are achievable. I mean, particularly now in the middle of the pandemic, it would be a real mistake to be ridiculously positive about the future and say things like, you know, within 6 months, we'll all be back to normal. Nobody's going to believe that. But what they will believe is an achievable future, which probably uses your values and your purpose at the center, but then describes how that's going to be played out over the coming months. And what an effective narrative does is recount who you are and where you're going. So people get a sense of their own personal stories. The third aspect of leadership, remember that they're holding, they're narrating, they're co-creating with values. So how does co-creation take place? Well, it's really about two things. Firstly, values, and secondly, experimentation. Let's take a look at values first. I think from these comments about a narrative, it's sort of obvious to you that values sit at the heart of a narrative. And they also sit at the heart of co-creation, where you're getting others involved in the story that you're telling. What you're trying to do by using those values in co-creation is to mobilize a sense of shared identity, to transform a diversity of perspectives. One of the most interesting pieces of advisory work we at HSM have done over the last couple of weeks is to work with one of the big telecoms to bring tens of thousands of people together on one of our platforms to talk about the future. And what was happening there is that as leaders came in as well, they could describe their values. They could mobilize the sense of shared identities as people heard each other and heard about what each other's identity was. And also, and importantly, they brought in a diversity of perspective, because one of the things that we've learned from the pandemic is that we're not all the same. We do different jobs, we live in different homes with different sorts of families, and our personality and work style is different. And so we really need that diversity of perspective to ensure that we're pulling everybody along. And finally, when it comes to co-creation, experimentation is absolutely critical. Now, we've always said that leaders who co-create do it by experimentation. But what's happening now, of course, is we have this extraordinary petri dish of experiments. There are hundreds and thousands of experiments going on right now in terms of where you work, when you work, how you work. The leader who's co-creating is able to make something of that. They're able to actually create freedom for these experiments to take place, to actually acknowledge that right now this is a process and time of co-creation, but also to really communicate tangible aims, to keep on showing where it is the organization is going, what its values are, and what its purpose is. So what actions should you be taking right now? Well, here's a brief summary of the 6 actions that we think your leaders should be have on their in tray, if they haven't already, right now. Number 1, listen to everybody. Make sure that the dialogue is with diverse perspectives, and tell a compelling narrative about an achievable future. I think that would have been impossible 68 days ago, but I think it is possible now. And I think it's important that leaders begin to move from the holding to the narrating and then to the experimenting. So, you know, the holding, promoting dialogue, the narrating, beginning to tell an achievable narrative, fostering a shared identity, helping people help each other, and then also using experiments to really think about what the future could be. Now, we've asked you to go on to the app that we sent you earlier. What are your leaders doing to lead through this pandemic? Just so we've got communication, opportunity, lots of communicate, keeping people safe, webcasts, hopefully with better connectivity than mine, but I'm sure I'm not the first person to have lost connectivity. Anything else that you're seeing leaders doing? Go to www.menti.com if you haven't already done so, and enter here we are, lots more coming on. Values, purpose, talking about purpose. Actually, you can see that some of your leaders are still very much focusing on the first aspect of that, which is showing empathy, communicating, helping their values. What about leaders helping people think about the future? Has anybody seen any examples of that? Yes, people are talking about purpose. Obviously, the biggest thing is leaders are communicating, they're listening, talking about their purpose. That seems to be absolutely crucial, that communicating their values, communicating purpose, being honest, being future orientated, empathic, seems to be really words that are important for how your leaders are leading through the pandemic, sharing their own experience. We'd love to hear more about that, because we think that that's going to be, that empathy is really about sharing their own experience, isn't it? At the same time, reassuring. You can see quite a lot of holding activities going on here, empathizing, sharing, showing their vulnerability, telling their personal stories. Some of them are moving into narrative, communicating, showing purpose and empathy. Some are probably also moving into co-creation, connecting to others, being human. So do take a look at the web page, and we sent it to you on our Anna, perhaps you can remind people what the web page is, what the web is.
Yes, it's in the chat box. It's www.menti.com.
Thank you. Super. Thanks. This is wonderful. Thank you so much. Lots and lots of ideas. But the thing that really seems to be coming out the most is communication, being visible. Now that's interesting. I've talked to CEOs recently, and they say that they're doing 8 hours of Zoom a day. And actually, of course, one of the things I'm sure you're beginning to worry about is their mental health. It's very, very difficult, as you know, to be doing these endless webinars because I'm just talking into a little green spot. It's not the same as addressing, and CEOs have told me that actually it's difficult for them to get the feedback because they're doing all the talking, but they're not getting any feedback. So that's why, you know, for example, some of the work we're doing right now, where we're joining up tens of thousands of people using our platform, has been a great way for leaders really to listen to what's happening right now. Okay, so I think we're probably on time now to move into Q&A. So shall we do that now? Let's move into the Q&A. Anna, what have you seen?
Thanks, Lynda. Yes, there's some great comments in the chat box. A lot of discussion around the narrative point, on how to build a narrative, how organisations are starting to build that narrative themselves. So a great comment that we've already talked through from Louise, who shared how in their organisation, she noted that it's difficult for some people, say finance people, tech people, to simplify a narrative into a way that you could tell a child, for example, and giving and teaching them how to use the hero structure is effective, which I think was a great point, and shows how we've been telling stories and narratives for thousands of years, and maintaining that structure and teaching your leaders to do that is so crucial.
That's very interesting. The hero structure. I mean, that's the Odyssey, presumably, the journey. And actually, heroes are almost always on journeys, aren't they? So that's a very, very interesting thought, that the leader as hero, the hero as the journey person, the person who's is moving forward to just like the Odyssey, to a future they're not on a journey they're not really clear about. So thank you. Thank you for that observation. Any particular questions, Anna, that you think we should? I can see lots coming through here. Any that we need to discuss?
Yeah. So there was an interesting discussion around balancing communication in the moment. So communicating tactics, having regular touch points, and also communicating a vision and strategy, so about the future. Kind of longer term form of narrative communication. So I think that's an interesting point to bring a question in on, which is how do leaders balance the two, which is communicating in the day-to-day so people can do actions and feel reassured in the moment, but also not losing that wider vision type narrative that is so important in building that sense of collective identity.
Yeah, that's a good point, isn't it? Because actually the holding is about communication, but actually the narrative is also communication, and the final piece, which is about experimentation, is and and co-creation, is also around communication. So that the patterns of communication are going to begin to change quite considerably. That's a really fascinating observation. But fundamentally, and of course, leaders are communicating in this rather odd way. That's why we think these large platforms where you get thousands of people together to talk to each other and to talk with leaders is a variety. I think we need to. I was talking to my great friend Hamini Ibarra, who some of you might know. She's a professor with me at London Business School. Yesterday, we walk every few days together, socially distanced walk, and she was saying that actually quite a lot of the fun of work has gone. We're just constantly doing the same thing over and over again. So I do think how you build variety, particularly variety into communication, is going to be really important, because otherwise people just sort of get sick of doing repetition.
And building on that variety point, Lynda, so there was an interesting question, or there's an interesting discussion around I guess the variance of individuals and how individuals have different responses to that. I'm broadening that out a little bit. There was an interesting question from Sharon around whether you think there will be different narratives in parallel as we stagger the return of the people to the workplace. So those who return versus those who are still at home or stood down. So I guess it's the variety of experiences that people have, How do you maintain that while you're building a narrative?
Yeah, I think that, Sharon, that's such an interesting question. I mean, I think one of the things that's come out is a real sense of diversity. And I've written something in MIT Sloan just this week, which will come out next week, which is really about just how diverse people are. And I'm thinking about three variables, really. One is the job that they're actually doing, particularly in terms of how much collaboration is required in it, because that changes the dynamics of home working. The second is their context. As I said earlier, being at home with 4 kids is not the same as being at home with no kids. And that's going to continue for quite a lot of time, I think. And the third is personality. I mean, it's very interesting. One of the few proper experiments of home working, which looked at call center workers, after 9 months, they said to the call workers, would you like to stay at home or do you want to come back into the office? 50% of them wanted to come back into the office. And that was because of that was a personality choice, a characteristic. So, you know, when we think about diversity, we need to think about the sort of jobs people are doing, their individual home circumstances, which we've never really talked about before to people. We've never, and also indeed their characters. And that's why in the work that we're doing right now, we're using this notion of personas to say, you know, what are the key personas in your organization? And what is the narrative what's the communication process with them? So you have a sort of an overwhelming sense of purpose and values. But I agree with Sharon that you have to really think about the channels. And I think this notion of personas, which we haven't really had to do very much in organizations, but I think really understanding who your people are and what they need right now has never been more important. Anna, back to you.
Lynda. And so for the final question, I'm going to move to thinking about the leaders themselves. So there were a few comments around leaders themselves being very stressed, understandably still being human, still having all the concerns that everyone else has, but having the added responsibility of having to lead people through this current moment. And so there was a question on this that was asking, what are the concerns that you're hearing from CEOs? And what are the concerns leaders themselves as individuals have, and how can an organisation help provide that holding, I guess, to leaders themselves?
Yeah. And I think, you know, those of you, you know, there's a lot of people on the webinar today from many countries and doing many sorts of jobs. So the job that you'll have may be a leader itself, it may be to support a leader. I think that that's a very important point. Certainly when I talk to CEOs, as I've done a little bit over the last couple of weeks, it's a very, very difficult job. And, you know, remember, not only are they doing this very difficult job now, but they're also facing a recession. And so, you know, for years to come, they're going to have a difficult time. How can you support them? Well, here's a couple of ideas right now. Number one, make sure they take time off. I don't know about you, but I'm finding these constant Zoom meetings very, very exhausting. And you need to really help them think about their own mental health. And the best way to manage mental health is to make sure they have time off. So number one, right now, even though they're probably still rushing ahead, make sure they have time to recuperate. This is going to be very, very important, the habits of recuperation. Secondly, this is the time for teams. You know, if they're a member of a team that's supportive, they need to really be delegating more across that team to take some of the stress off themselves. So I'd really look carefully at how the teams are working around your leaders, so that they're taking stuff off the leader, so the leader isn't overwhelmed with what's happening to them. And then thirdly, I would use the process of co-creation. As I said earlier, we've used some of our wonderful jam platforms in the last few weeks with companies in a sort of crisis jam, where the leader has the opportunity to hear from thousands of people. Now remember, very often the reason people took that leadership job is they wanted to hear from thousands of people. They wanted to hear what others were saying. And you know, processes like Zoom break that. You cannot hear thousands of people, but there are technologies where you can. And I would definitely engage your leader in technologies where they can get the positive feedback from thousands of people about what they're doing and about where the organization should be going.
Great, thanks Lynda, and thank you all very much for sharing your insights and questions in the chat. There's some really great discussions, and it was really fantastic to see such great examples being shared of how organisations are starting to build that narrative themselves, and the ways that they're doing so. So I'll pass back to you, Lynda, to wrap up the webinar.
Yes, thanks. Thank you very much, Anna. Well, so here we are, webinar number 3. We've got one more to go, which we're rather hopefully calling the return to the new normal. I'm not sure if we said we put that naming down a month ago. I'm not sure if we would still call it that, but anyway, it's you can see the date. It's June the 4th. So please do join us. If you've got colleagues that that you think would enjoy that, ask them to come along. I promise that by then I will have perfect internet connection. I've got a dongle or a dongle or something which is going to solve all my problems. I'm sure you've had promises like that as well. So let me just summarize where we are today. Leadership's never been more important. Leaders are now on a journey, the hero's journey. They're holding, they're engaging in narratives, they're co-creating. This is an enormously important issue. This afternoon, you'll receive a resource pack, which has got this webinar recording in it, and key insights from both today and from the whole series. We at HSM are here to support you through these very difficult times. It's interesting to think that 10 years ago, I started a consortium called the Future of Work Consortium. And of course, the future of work is now happening right now. Let me, just before I finish, I'm sorry, I'm fiddling around with my books here. Before I finish, show you my great news, which is our new book, The New Long Life, out next Friday. So no champagne this time around, but lots of Zooms. And those of you who read the Sunday Times, we have a huge piece in the Sunday Times this weekend. So if you want to see a picture of Andrew and I, please do. Otherwise, we'll keep in touch. Stay safe. Thank you to all my amazing HSM team, particularly to Anna for staying calm through what was quite a challenging hour. Callie for moving things around so much, Lottie, and of course Ellen for the design. So thank you very much. See you in June. Bye.